So my name is Katie Ware. I am the Washington Policy Manager for Renewable Northwest. Renewable Northwest is a nonprofit renewable energy advocacy organization, and our mission is to decarbonize the region by accelerating the transition to renewable electricity. You can imagine most of our work in Washington overlaps with CETA-related advocacy. Renewable Northwest has been and will continue to be active throughout the implementation of CETA, including through various rulemakings at the state agencies and utility resource planning processes. The rules implementing the law and the utilities compliance efforts are key to reaching CETA's standards and achieving real decarbonization. So moving to the meat of the discussion, a lot of work went into the development of the 2021 State Energy Strategy, and I think it's a great place to anchor this conversation. Others on the call appear to agree, as it's been mentioned a handful of times today. The State Energy Strategy finds that to achieve 100% clean electricity by 2045, there must be an acceleration of investment in renewable resources and transmission. And in order to realize full resource and geographic diversity, which will bring down costs, we must take a regional approach to new investment in infrastructure, coordinating with neighboring states during planning. That's why I mentioned at the top of the call that maybe some sort of regional framing should be added to the charter, because I think that's important, and that aligns with recommendations made in the State Energy Strategy. I also think it's important to keep an eye on the potential for regional market expansion, as that development should pay off in cost savings over CETA's timeline, as well as meaningful resource adequacy improvements. The strategy looked at 5 decarbonization scenarios, and a key takeaway from all the scenarios is that greater interconnection among the 11 Western states and improved regional coordination is vital to lowering overall decarbonization costs. I also want to mention something that was released recently, the 2021 draft power plan, in which the council did not specifically study the expansion of the transmission system, but they ultimately recommended that the region work together to run such a study. Which is interesting. And I think that until we have this study, we can do other things like look at resource maps and costs to judge where points of congestion may be. Looking in state, our strongest solar and wind resources are in Eastern Washington, and clean generation in the East needs to be brought west. And clearly this is in contrast to other recommendations made today, specifically the recommendation to build generation close to load. That generation works really well for fossil fuels, but obviously not as well for resources that perform much better where it's windy and sunny. One other point on this that I wanted to call attention to is that these clean resources are often located in rural areas where communities would really benefit from the tax benefits these projects bring. So we have to weigh cost and benefits. And the State Energy Strategy is one place you can look to find a specific scenario that clearly shows we would be at a disadvantage not to pursue full geographic diversity of clean resources. So that's state. Looking regionally, points of congestion limiting the movement of Southwest solar and Northwest wind, particularly in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, will become increasingly important. Washington Utilities IRPs and presentations today support this. And the current national focus on offshore wind may indicate that resource could become cost competitive earlier than previously thought, meaning we should start thinking about investment in transmission to access it. Okay, so that's the state efforts covered as far as I can see it now. And I also wanted to touch on utility planning efforts, because I think there may be near-term efficiencies to be gained there. For example, in PSE's 2021 IRP, the company ran a sensitivity to explore firm transmission as a percentage of resource nameplate capacity, given renewables often generate below their maximum outputs. PSE's results for that scenario indicated there may be some cost savings with securing firm transmission as a percentage of nameplate capacity, but the company ultimately didn't feel the savings would add materially to IRP portfolio development. So they didn't pursue that. And we still recommend that PSE and others continue exploring solutions like that to get at transmission underutilization. We also look forward to other modeling efforts at PSE and other utilities related to co-location of wind and solar with shared limited capacity or sorry, transmission capacity due to the complementary relationship between the generation profiles of those resources. So yeah, to sum, I think that there's a lot of potential in the modeling efforts of the utilities to get at some of these inefficiencies and underutilizations. So I wanted to call attention to that, because even though maybe it's not something we can really get at in the recommendations for the report, maybe, maybe we can, maybe that is possible, but I do think it's important to consider all realms of impact that we can make. And these are my initial thoughts. I know this is short compared to other presentations given today, but I kept it specific to the framing questions, and I look forward to contributing to other topics in future meetings. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate that. And nothing wrong with having a shorter presentation. I'm sure you'll be asked lots of questions. So we'll try to make up your time that way. So thank you for that. Vlad, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'm Vlad Gutman-Britten. I'm the Washington State Director at Climate Solutions. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the group to participate in this and the panel. Climate Solutions, we do work in Washington and in Oregon. We're a clean energy nonprofit dedicated to accelerating solutions to the climate crisis. Our overwhelming focus is on energy versus other types of emissions, which are also pretty important. And so decarbonizing the sort of energy economy in our two states is our kind of core mission. Climate Solutions has been a lead advocate on most of the major, or a part of the lead advocacy. It has had a leading advocacy role on many of the major policies that have been adopted in the state over the last few years that are fundamentally driving the likely increase in demand for electricity, and in particular for renewable electricity, which is what necessitates a lot of the this transmission discussion. So we're deeply involved in CETA, but also Clean Fuel Standard and the Climate Commitment Act, all of which are going to contribute to a move in the direction that Glenn in particular has described on behalf of Commerce as part of the state energy strategy. We do that work in Oregon as well. My counterparts down there were heavily involved in the drafting and the passage of their 100% clean electricity law, which obviously also contributes to the same fundamental regional dynamics that we've heard so much about in terms of need for renewables and new renewables and for the capacity to bring them from where they're generated to where they need to be used. I think from our perspective, we see a really high priority for utility scale generation. I share the sort of concern that Katie kind of identified about, generation close to load is great and it's ideal, but given the sort of, resource characteristics and the climate in the places where we have load in the Northwest, that functionally means most of the time will mean fossil fuels. There are some resources, there are some, variable renewable resources that can be sited in Western Washington. There are some non-variable renewable resources that can be sited in small quantities, potentially like geothermal and things like that in Western Washington that are closer to load centers. But fundamentally, the bulk of the available generation compared to where the load is likely to be consumed requires, our ability to bring energy across long distances, as the state energy strategy has shown. We see a really high value for distributed resources as a way to distribute energy resources as a way to decrease the amount of this kind of generation and the associated transmission that are necessary. But mostly we see that value coming from energy efficiency deployment and demand response and a variety of other resources like that, right? We can reduce our overall loads and our peaks through those methods. We are less bullish on the potential for distributed generation, rooftop solar and the like, to provide those same services. Distributed generation is certainly a part of the solution, but we just don't think that it's likely to be at scales necessary to eliminate the need for new transmission or eliminate the need for large utility scale generation east of the Cascades. We have over the years commissioned a number of projects that have looked at decarbonizing our electricity system and decarbonizing our electricity system plus electrification of various sectors. We had a project last year that looked at decarbonization of the Washington and Oregon transportation sector paired with a CETA compliant pathway for electricity. And in all of those studies, we've analyzed the potential for including distributed generation as a kind of a component of serving the load. And what we found consistently is the models that we've kind of used have deployed no incremental distributed generation, which doesn't mean that there's no new distributed generation happening, but those policies, the CETA and the electrification policies, fundamentally don't change the economics to make distributed generation favorable, meaning that we can deploy it and it will potentially replace some utility scale generation, but it would do so at a higher incremental cost now than a utility-based approach. We don't necessarily need to, and nor do I think we should, pursue state policy that is exclusively focused on least cost strategies to decarbonization. There's a lot of other priorities, environmental and cultural and other priorities like that need to be reconciled that may necessitate and point us in the direction of increased distributed generation as a strategy for dealing with our decarbonization priorities as a way to reduce some of those other things. But fundamentally, I think we need to recognize that trade-off, that any choice we make like that increases costs for individuals, for the economy, and things like that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a one-for-one replacement. We can't replace large-scale renewable generation for distributed generation on rooftops and things like that. That's especially the case because the higher the penetration of those resources, the lower their value. Which ultimately means that the ability for us to replace the large-scale utility projects is going to be very difficult, very expensive, and maybe impossible. So I think the other thing that I sort of mentioned that I think is really important to us in this process is that I think it goes without saying, really valid interests beyond just climate and energy and reliability. Those are critical interests. And so being able to craft a policy and an approach that enables us to recognize all those values in developing projects on the front end is really essential. So identifying ways that utilities and project developers can know on the front end where areas of high sensitivity are is really important. Knowing what the state and various stakeholders and tribal nations and other folks require of projects in terms of impact minimization and mitigation, so that those things are factored in on the front end of the project design and the proposal, rather than only at the back end after an extensive process that is frequently historically been very long, so that we can incorporate those things on the front end and build in that communication, those expectations, and that level set on the front end is really important. And hopefully that's a way to improve outcomes while also shortening the process for approval and construction of these facilities. So I think I'll stop there. I think maybe I gradually shifted into rambling a little bit toward the end there, but hopefully that was what you all were looking for.
I did not hear any rambling going on, Vlad. So I think you're A-okay.
Oh, let me try again. No.
No, that is great. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm just checking real quick to see if Anders Bisgard has joined us, or Joe, Lauren, have we heard anything from Anders?
I have not, and I'm not seeing him in the meeting just yet.
Okay, then I think we will be very happy that we heard from Katie and Vlad in this regard, and would invite any questions or observations from them. And by the way, both of you, Katie and Vlad, Katie, if something Vlad said kind of stimulates a thought on your behalf or on your point, please feel free to make it, and you don't have to wait for somebody to ask a question. Questions for these two? We can't let them get off the hook just because it's after lunch. Somebody's got to come up with a tough question.
So Joe's got one too.
All right.
I'll start. I hear what you're saying in terms of there are concerns about the transmission system itself and the generation and the load, but we also face the realities of where the utility scale generation of renewables is most appropriate, and that all needs transmission. Any thoughts about, I mean, you talked about looking at values in terms of making sure they're represented up front. And I know there's some processes in the state that hopefully will help us get there. But also perhaps looking at, I know actually, I believe I know this, that developers do look at access to available transmission when they're looking at placement of sites. Do either of you want to talk a little bit about that?
I guess what I'd say about that is that they do that, like we don't, they do that because it's available, because it's cheaper than constructing new transmission, you know, it's faster than constructing new transmission. So, you know, I have a pretty high confidence that that whenever possible, utilities and the developers will more or less prioritize that, because it has so many benefits compared to, you know, attempting to build a new project or relying on one being built. So that should always be the first priority. We should build renewables on brownfields. We should connect them to existing transmission where it's available and there's flat capacity. You know, I mean, the presence of transmission, existing transmission, makes certain types of what otherwise might be not especially cost-effective renewable projects cost-effective. There's a proposal to build a fairly large solar project near where the current coal generation facility is in Centralia, and that's related to the fact that there's flat capacity and it's near load and things like that. It's almost certain that that project wouldn't have been proposed had transmission not been available there, because Western Washington is just not as good of a resource for solar, and constructing that transmission would have increased costs. So there, you know, that priority for using existing resources that don't require extra construction is both really important, but also I think sort of baked into the basic economics of the choices that utilities make. And so a lot of what we're solving is, I think we're charged to solve, is that's not always going to hack it and we'll need more. And so how do we build more in a way that's with high integrity, protects environmental values, that protects cultural values, and, you know, the variety of other things we sort of identified through these conversations. I like your background. Go on.
There you go. Kathleen, did that get your question answered? Okay, great. I'm going to go to Joe and then Rob and then Glenn.
Thanks. I was wondering if maybe Katie could talk a little bit more about the idea of matching. This has to do more with resource and load, and the idea of matching a load profile with sort of a generation profile, and how significant that could be.
Well, when I mentioned building close to load, that was with reference to that suggestion being made earlier in the call, but I wasn't saying it as a way that alluded to matching actual generation with load shapes. But if you're asking for my perspective on that, that would obviously fold into other conversations being had in the CETA implementation sphere. And I think that Joe, let me just make sure that I'm understanding your question before I ramble on about something you're not really asking.
Oh, well, I guess I'm trying to get an idea of resource quality. You know, how much better is wind in Wyoming versus wind in Washington, and is it? I think that Nicholas maybe addressed this idea of making sure that it's really important that the resource generation profile matches the load profile. So and this is probably more of a question for someone who is working in renewable resource work day in and day out, but just curious.
Oh
if you
yeah,
have-
well, I think that fits with what I'm saying about keeping our minds open regionally and being aware of the fact that what we're not able to meet here in Washington at a certain time, there's potentially other places in the region that has excess that would be able to be shared, importing and exporting to balance things out. And that seems to be supported by work done in preparing the state energy strategy, and seems to be supported by a lot of the modeling being done by utilities, and that it all sort of drives the conversation toward the importance of market expansion and just being generally like aware of regional efficiencies and trying our best not to overbuild for short-term gains, and thinking longer term in terms of strategy. And yeah, that would include matching the generation to something closer to what is being needed at a certain utility in Washington.
I do think for the utilities to sort of speak to how the shapes sort of align with their load, and it might be useful for them to do so. I guess I'd sort of say two things to that question though. One is there are some ways that the load shapes in different geographies just match utilities gaps better. So for example, the sun rises earlier, the further east you go. And so Montana solar is potentially more likely to be generating during our morning peak than Washington solar would, right? Because the sun is already up there when it's potentially still rising here. It's sort of a rudimentary example of how that might happen. But I think the other thing that's sort of important is that the other issue is not just the shape, but also the diversity of resources. So when the wind's not blowing in the gorge at one wind turbine, it's very likely not blowing at the gorge at the next wind turbine. But there's a higher likelihood that a wind facility that's further away does have wind. And so that ability to sort of patch that variability and smooth it all together is part of the reason that diversity is necessary. If all of your variable renewables are in one place, they're all likely not generating at the same time, or they're all likely generating at the same time, both of which are of low value the rest of the time. And so having renewables in multiple places makes it more likely that maybe it's cloudy over here, but not cloudy at this solar facility, or the wind's not blowing here and it is blowing there. So I think that's part of how you sort of match it up versus just the direct load shape in any one single region versus the generation shape versus the load shape, I'm sorry. But I do think maybe if some of the IOU or COU people are on, they can and have something to contribute to Joe's question. I think they might have a useful perspective as well.
So let me just check real quick. And I do see that there are other hands with other questions patiently waiting here, but let me just check. Tom from PSC or Sarah PSC, anyone, I'm just looking to see if the Avista and Pacific Corp folks are on. Anything to add or any response to what Vlad and Katie have been saying?
So is it okay if I jump in, Nicholas?
It
here?
is totally okay if you jump in.
Okay. First of all, I 100% agree with Vlad, which is unusual for me to say. So Vlad, way to go. No, but in all seriousness, I think he really does describe the situation very well. That when you have a much bigger region from which you can draw power, you can take the advantages of the diversity of production across the wider area. And I think that that's a real value. And I actually think that that's what markets are going to allow us to explore more efficiently. But I would also point out that there's other sorts of reliability concerns that are more related to actually, do you have enough steel in the ground to get, and this, I'm just going to go back to the example I gave, over the mountains. And if you don't, markets aren't going to fix that problem. So I think that there's great opportunities for diversity, but you still have to have the steel in the ground to get the power to the load. And I do worry think I made it pretty clear. I do worry about our ability to do that over the Cascade Mountain range. So with that, I will sign off.
Thanks, Nicholas. Don't sign off too far. All right, I'm going to hop over to Rob and then to Glenn, who both have questions and are in the queue. So Rob, please.
Get to my mute button. Thank you, Susan.
Mhm.
And it's sort of a bit of a comment and a question. What we observed looking at and talking to the Power Council staff is that solar has become so inexpensive that it is displacing energy efficiency conservation measures in their portfolio. And so I hear that from the Power Council. I've worked with conservation advocates who believe that, you know, the benefits of conservation may be undervalued because, you know, they're essentially free from hydro integration concerns that are otherwise have yet to be priced with respect to renewables, and perhaps free from, you know, concerns with pygmy rabbits, sage grouse, couse, which is a root, and other things. So have you thought about what the role of energy efficiency is in these, you know, multifaceted portfolios to achieve the clean energy goals? And perhaps this is a framing question with regard to the legislation itself. I'm just not sure. So if you'd help me understand that, that'd be great.
Katie or Vlad?
I mean, I can't speak to the power plan, and I have heard from conservation advocates that there's concern around, you know, what you're describing, which is the sort of reduced role of efficiency in the plan. I can't speak to that, or I'm not tracking at that level, but maybe Katie can, or other folks on the call. I do think that efficiency is sort of an essential part of the recipe. And in fact, if I don't have it in front of me, but if I recall correctly, you know, if you compare for example, in Puget's IRP, that the amount of efficiency they're planning on acquiring under the 2021 IRP compared to the pre-CETA IRPs, the amount substantially increased, right? So that kind of requirement to fully decarbonize the system really significantly increased the amount of energy efficiency that they found that utility, and likely many other utilities, found to be cost effective. And maybe one of the future folks can put some numbers to that. So I do think it's important. I think we're going to do much more of it the more we kind of push to decarbonize our system. My point is that it's not going to serve all of our energy needs. I don't think it's likely to serve all of our energy needs if we are to successfully decarbonize our economy, which doesn't make it not important. It makes it very, very important, but it also means that the work we're doing here to figure out hopefully how and where to site transmission is no less important. We will need that, in almost any future, no matter how aggressive we are in pursuing energy efficiency. I guess is how I think about it. Important, but doesn't obviate the need for this conversation and for the conversation on how and where to build utility scale assets.
And the only thing I would add is that this is something PSC or someone else could build upon, one of the utilities, because they've been working on this modeling, but CETA has protections in place that require utilities to model in a certain way that protects the value of things like energy efficiency and demand response, because it is hard to model them side by side with something like solar, and have the model choose, EE or DR. So they do make attempts to force the model to consider those on a more equal basis, in compliance with CETA, but also just with a practical mind to how these models work. And I'm sure someone else could speak to those details better than me, but just to call out that there are special attempts made to not like completely diminish energy efficiency in order to reap the benefits of cheap solar.
Thanks, Katie. Rob, do you have anything you want to follow up on there? We could also see if one of the utility folks would like to speak to that. And Ian, I don't know if that's why your hand is up, if you wanted to speak to that in particular. But Rob, do you want me to ask around a little?
Susan, thank you, Susan and Katie and Vlad. Good, helpful answers. And I have to jump to another call. But if anybody has information that regarding the modeling that Katie was talking about, you know, Ian, if that's you or anybody else, feel free to send an email to EFSEC or to me if you can get my email address. I'm sure they'll pass that on. Love to talk to you about it.
Thanks. Thanks, Rob. And thanks again for your presentation this morning. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, Glenn, you have been waiting for a while. Let's go to Glenn and then we'll hop over to Ian.
Thanks. This is a question for Katie. I'm interested in kind of the experience that renewable energy developers have, maybe from other parts of the country, with using like a renewable energy zone process to kind of sort through geographic areas and screen them for items of concern, and then try to identify areas that are both high value for renewable energy production, but also cause as small an impact as possible in terms of other considerations. And I've read about that, like I've seen work that NREL has done on that, and Texas has like a competitive renewable energy zone. And I just wondered if there was any insight from the developers of renewable projects about whether that type of approach is actually helpful, or does it just kind of create a lot of work and not necessarily any good answers.
Well, I wish Anders was here because I'm sure he'd have a great answer. Vlad, I saw you shaking your head, so you probably know more about this than me. Maybe not, I won't put you on the spot. But Vlad, or sorry, Glenn, I guess I'm not completely clear. I've heard this idea mentioned in other CETA conversations, and I'm not totally familiar about on how that would actually work as a developer, and if it would be limiting with how they prospect sites or actually helpful. And that would be the question, which is always the question when you talk maps and how to separate these things on a map to help a developer or a utility or an agency in working through these siting processes. But yeah, I'm not honestly sure whether that would be helpful in this context or any, and if it is relevant in this region at all, to be honest.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, if any of your members have
I'll reach out
on that, that'd be great to hear about that.
Vlad, did you have anything you wanted to add? Nope. Okay, and just curious if there's anyone else, utility or otherwise, that would have any perspective on that or any familiarity with that. Happy to entertain any comments. Okay. All right, so have a note there that could be another really great piece of information to find, so we can track that as well. And Katie and Vlad, follow up with you and maybe with Anders about that. Ian, your hand is up and you have been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. The conversation about matching resources to load kind of got me thinking. I'd be really curious to hear, Vlad and Katie, what your thoughts on energy storage are and what role, or lack thereof, it might play in transmission planning and transmission siting in the congestion problems we might be facing in the future.
Who wants to take that one first? Katie?
Well, I don't really know where to begin. I think it's clear if you look at any of Renewable Northwest advocacy in basically anything that we think batteries play a very important role in this transition. We're constantly advocating for ways to better model that resource and better value, ancillary services that those resources would bring. And so, yeah, it does frustrate us when we see storage resources, I guess, seemingly limited in certain portfolio modeling exercises. But, that's all a matter of perspective. But yeah, we think that standalone storage is faring well in many parts of the country. I know there's arguments to be made about it depending on what region you're talking about. We think that hybrid resources have a lot of potential in the Northwest, and and as cost projections show, it will only continue to get cheaper, and we think that it's something, while limited to a certain duration of discharge, that, like Vlad and I have been talking, the resource diversity is important, and it's a difficult thing to work out, but how to get it accurately reflected during portfolio modeling so that you're able to fully realize that diversity benefit. That's sort of like where our advocacy sits right now, especially coming out of an IRP cycle and moving into a CEIP cycle here in Washington.
Katie, can you, just for those who may not know, and I would be in that group, what is a hybrid storage resource as opposed to a standalone?
Yeah, hybrid storage resource would be paired with a clean energy resource here in Washington. So like solar typically. So solar plus storage, that's what I mean by hybrid. But you also see wind plus storage, and you sometimes see tri-hybrid wind solar storage projects as well.
Great, thank you. Vlad, did you want to jump on that question from Ian?
I agree with Katie. I think that depending on where you locate the storage, it's not just a way to shape that to match up generation and load. It's also a way to avoid transmission congestion. If it's close to load, you can get it there. Then at congested times, you don't need to bring as much power over. So there's a sort of a variety of things there. But again, sort of my basic frame on all of this stuff is that all of this helps and reduces the amount of utility scale transmission and generation and things like that needs to be constructed, but it doesn't really get it close to zero. I'm persuaded, for example, by, I think it was in 2019, that a bunch of utilities worked together to do the regional RA assessment over our 6-state footprint that looked at ELCC values for a variety of resources. And I'm not saying that those numbers are exactly right, but like philosophically, or at a high level, that the results of that research is what we find, which is that storage has decreasing value, just like solar, and especially solar in a specific location, and wind and everything else. All of these have decreasing values at higher penetrations, which doesn't mean they're not important and not a critical part of the solution, but it doesn't, again, obviate the need for a diverse renewable footprint and the transmission to bring it to load centers. And I think you could probably answer your own question better and in more detail than we can. But I think philosophically it's important, but it's not gonna take us all the way to eliminating the need for these sorts of projects in a system, a policy regime that enables them to be constructed.
Really appreciate those perspectives. Thank you.
Anything else?
I guess the only thing I'd say is that unless there are some sort of substantial, new breakthroughs in things like long duration storage and things like that, which we're not quite there yet, but the current storage that's available to utilities now. That's especially the case because we have a high storage system already, because our hydro system provides a lot of storage capacity, right? So additional storage is very valuable here, but potentially less valuable than it would be in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in at the very end that if we're talking modeling, we're talking these things related to storage. Another of our focuses is making sure that we have the most accurate picture of loss of load events, what those actually look like, how long they are, how, you know, not just, you know, frequency, but duration of these events, and getting those right and making sure that the data informing those modeling efforts is as accurate as possible, like updating weather data and things like that, so that we're actually able to understand the need when there is a need, and what resources can fill that. But just to add that perspective, thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Vlad. Other questions from anyone? Looking here. All right. Well, unlike
if I could just jump in, I got an email from Anders saying he's trying to join. I don't know if he's prepared to present, but he is trying to join.
Great.
I don't know if he's sitting in the waiting room.
Don't see him there.
Okay. I don't want to derail this whole thing, but just wanted to let you know that he is attempting to come in.
Could you or would you forward that email to Lauren, and then maybe
He
she
is
can...
actually just admitted. He just popped into the waiting room and is here now.
This is very exciting to be waiting for him. He must love knowing that he's going to come into a room full of people.
Anders is in the house.
Oh my goodness. All right. Anders, are you with us yet? Soon. Okay. So here's what while we're waiting for Anders to come in here, I will say again, and you all should have that same mural link. If you can hop over to mural while we are waiting, what we would be doing if we weren't waiting for Anders is I would be asking you to move over to the mural room or the mural board, and once again try to capture those key points under those framing questions that we have up there based on the presentation you just heard. Some really interesting conversation. Again, we've had a lot of this today, which is wonderful. But if you could hop over to the mural and jot some things down while we're waiting for Anders, who looks like is here now. So I'm going to, but still do that. Still go over to the mural board, and I'm going to see if we can get Anders. Anders, I'm looking for you here. I see you on my list. What we would love to know if you are prepared at all to make any remarks about the framing questions we have regarding energy and transmission needs and opportunities for renewables. I'm not hearing you. So I would say while we're waiting.
Did you see the chat that he's unable to hear?
Lauren, could you help Anders do a little troubleshooting there? And in the meantime, we'll
see what we can do.
Okay. Let us know, and Anders hopefully will let us know when he can hear us, and then we can hear him. And in the meantime, let's just take 5 minutes or so, hop over to the mural board and jot down any of those interesting observations that you have. I'll go ahead and put that link back in just in case people don't have it. And yeah, just take 5 minutes or so and jot down your thoughts, and we are chasing Anders down and actually going to send him the phone number and see if he can just call in. Poor guy, I hope he's realizing how popular he is to hear him speak. So we'll see what he has to say. Let me know if you are not able to get into the mural board, then just chat in anything that you would add there, and we're very happy to add it for you. So please just take a moment and you can fill that in.
Susan, it sounds like he called in and he can now hear. So perhaps we can hear from him as well.
That's great. So I think the question would be, can he both hear and speak?
There we go. Can you hear me now? This is Anders
We
Bisgard
can,
with Avangrid.
Anders. Awesome. This is
Oh
great.
Lord, this is so. I'll declare this as my victory for the day and move on.
Well, thank you for joining, and don't mean to put you on the spot. So please, if you don't feel that you're prepared for this, we were hoping, as Katie and Vlad did, that you would be able to speak a little bit from your perspective on those framing questions that we had on the agenda, and very happy to put those up as well.
If you
But
could
yes,
do that again, yes, please.
Sure, you bet. Let me grab them. Hang on just a minute. I'm taking comfort in the fact that people are still putting stuff into Mural, so this is all a-okay. So here are the questions. Anders, can you see the chat?
I can see the chat.
Okay,
Yes.
then
I
I'm
can.
gonna drop these questions into the chat for everybody, and if you could speak to those
Okay.
from your perspective, Avangrid's perspective, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So Avangrid Renewables, we're a large IPP with a very large presence here in the Northwest. We are a U.S. publicly traded company. We've got huge presence in Portland, Oregon. That's kind of the origins of the IPP side of the company. I'm the Senior Director for Interconnections and Transmission, so I run our U.S. interconnection and transmission function. So we sell stuff. We sell renewable power to customers. So if there's a customer out there, I can hook you up with some of our sales and origination team, and they would gladly talk to you. Utility scale, right? Interconnect to BPA, and then figure out with our customers collaboratively as to what's the right way to get that renewable power to their load. So I think that's kind of the highlight of what Avangrid Renewables is and does. The history of the company, we actually started here in the Northwest. There's a long corporate history of how we ended up where we are today, but have been here for a long time, much longer than I've been with the company. I've been with the company about 12 years now. In terms of the second one, wow, that is so deal specific. It's really hard to get into specifics, but I mean, generally speaking, in the Northwest and in Washington State, you've got nice, good renewable resources on the east side of the mountains, and then you got a bunch of load on the west side of the mountains. And so the question comes up, how do you get it from one side to the other side? And that is a challenging prospect. And I think that's probably the single biggest challenge out there, lining all of that stuff up and getting all of these different processes to work together, right? Okay, customers, whether that be customers like Puget, customers like Seattle City, C&I customers, right? Big customers like Boeing or Microsoft or Amazon, right? How do we line their procurement processes up with our interconnection process that we have to run through with BPA, right? And then the transmission process to actually get the power from our project to the customer. How do we line that process up? And then our permitting process, both at the local project and if there's a big upgrade that needs to happen, that process. And that's the magic. And it's a real challenge. So I think that's kind of the big picture. That's kind of, generally speaking, those are the areas, how we look at this. But once we get customers that have reasonable expectations and a reasonable schedule, we have historically been able to align all of those things.
Anders, could you clarify for me? I'm taking notes and others maybe as well. So I have getting procurement process lined up, and then I think you mentioned 4 things: procurement lined up with X, and then permitting process. What were those 2 mid pieces? Procurement lined up with?
It's the interconnection process,
Thank you.
and then if there's a construction schedule that goes along with that. Well, there is a construction process that goes along with that schedule, and then lining that one up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just wanted clarification there. All right. Katie, I'm going to go back over to you. There was a question where you said, boy, if Anders were here, he could really answer that. And I'm looking back at my notes to see if I can figure out where that was. Do you recall?
That was Glenn at Department of Commerce. He had a great question about sort of like, what did he call it? What renewable energy areas or zones? Okay.
Zones, yeah.
Yeah, can you re-ask your question, Glenn, since Anders is here?
Yeah, but I'm gonna double dip. So my first question was about whether you and other developers have seen success with kind of comprehensive review of a big geographic area to screen out high priority development zones and avoid, you know, undue impacts on various other resources that you know, we, rather than doing it more on a piecemeal acre by acre basis. But then the bonus question that I would ask you is about whether state transmission agencies like New Mexico has, and now recently Colorado has moved ahead to create one of those, whether developers see any promise in having more of a state role in developing transmission resources.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've actually been a real world developer. I've been working the transmission interconnection side quite a bit. I think the balancing act on all these permitting groups and permitting regimes, it's just that, it's a balancing act. And we've seen some success. We've seen where other places where it's just more process. And I think that's the places where it's valuable is where it has been it hasn't been just more process on top of the existing process, right? Where it actually does streamline things and allow I'm just talking process. I'm not talking regulations or any of that stuff, just the process, right? And that, yeah, if it does that, then it's definitely a benefit. And there have been a few places around the country, and I just know they exist. Beyond that, I would be over my ski tips speaking to anything detailed on that one. As for state transmission agencies, same thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And they kind of go hand in. I think they kind of go hand in hand. Often they go hand in hand. I can't, and I'd really appreciate it if I can't touch New Mexico right now for some reasons that are going on with Avangrid, our parent company. So there's a small potential transaction that's going through reviews that I can't just. That's all I want to say about New Mexico.
All right, thank you. Glenn, anything else?
No, we're just, you know, throwing ideas out here. So I appreciate whatever level people might have in terms of information about it.
Okay, and
Yep.
Clint, I see your hand there, but I'm going to hop over to Vlad just as the panelist to see if he wants to respond in some way.
Well, I don't have a response. I do have I do think it might be, so these sort of zones may not be helpful to developers, but they may be helpful to other interests. And so it would, in addition to asking that question of, you know, of Anders or other folks within that sort of constituency, it'd be helpful to know if conservation advocates or tribal, you know, there's other stakeholders. So it's possible to have a system that doesn't necessarily solve all the siting issues related to, let's say, transmission from the developer perspective, but does help solve a set of farmland preservation or habitat protection or cultural resource issues. And so, you know, I think Clickitat, right, has such a policy. So it might be helpful to hear. I'm not trying to create agendas for you all, but yeah, but I do think it might be helpful to hear from places that have this, how it's worked for them, because it may serve other needs, even if it doesn't fully address the need on the developer side. And that's
Gotcha.
also very valid and important to incorporate. I guess that add that question to Glenn's maybe for a future meeting, I guess.
Definitely. Thank you. Appreciate that. Clint.
Anders and maybe Katie or Vlad can chime in. My question is let's skip from the difficulties on siting, and now you got a site up and running, a renewable site up and running. Nicholas shared this morning a partial map of generation sites in Western Washington, a lot of natural gas facilities. And my question is as we get down the road on 20 CETA, and these plants need to be neutral, how do we get to the point where we can have a base load that can shape some of these intermittent resources and have a viable product for utilities to be able to purchase? I understand you said you could put contracts together now, or understood it that way, but where's that baseload shaping going to come from? And diversity is great, and I know we need that. That will help. But where's the baseload going to come from in the post 2030 timeframe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a little bit above my pay grade, but I do think that there are. I mean, we've got a gen-only BA right now. That's one of the things Avangrid has, and our ability to balance our own generation is one of those. And there's a lot of technologies out there getting at that. I think batteries are part of it, that's one of the big challenges for our business right now is how do we do that, right? It's the worst, in Anders' opinion, and to a certain extent Avangrid's opinion. You got to stay reliable, right? That's gonna do all sorts of negative things all over the place if you get into an unreliable scenario, and so we got to figure that one out. I don't think we're there in the near term here, but I'm also not a utility. I think their utilities could speak to that one a lot better than I could, Clint. But I think that reliability and is what I think you're getting at there, and what happens afterwards is a key thing, and that's a big challenge that we're going to have to figure out. And I don't have a good strategy right now. Diversity, geographic diversity is part of that, absolutely. I think batteries are part of that. Utility scale batteries are part of that. I think those are two of the big parts, but I think there are, I don't know what other options there are out there. That is a challenge. And I think that is the one thing we all got to think about in this is that just reliability. We got to keep this reliable. You can't have people buying into, can't expect people to buy into stuff if we have things, if we don't have a reliable energy supply.
Thank you.
Thanks. Clint, anything else?
I guess I don't.
Oh.
I was just going to say, I guess I don't think about if by baseload you mean sort of a traditional like baseload generation, the large thermal plant that never turns off. Like, I don't think that's we have challenges on our long-term challenges on resource planning and resource deployment, but I don't think that's the thing that we need. What we need is not the base upon which you build an additional generation, but the other side of it. You need dispatchable resource. Yeah, right. But it's not. But it's not what people traditionally. That's not what we need. Is not that doesn't contribute or help manage the system, having those large always on resources. In fact, Washington or the Northwest does have some of that and will continue to have some of that. Hydro contributes somewhat to that. We have a nuclear facility, which is a traditional baseload facility. But the thing that the Northwest needs is the flexible resource that can be turned on to fill in gaps and serve peaks versus the kind of traditional mode of thinking about baseload, which again is the large thermal high capacity factor resource. So that is the utility sector nationally is and in Washington really is looking toward gas plants sort of often by default, which we discourage, and obviously we think CETA is intended to reduce and get away from over time. Modeling, again, Commerce's modeling as well as other modeling shows that those kind of highly flexible dispatchable resources end up having pretty small capacity factors because their role is that shaping and filling in gaps versus, you know, large energy service. And that's the way I think we're going to think about that. I also think it's just really important to note that the 2030 target is an 80% target, more or less in both Washington and Oregon, right? So it retains a decent amount of space for, you know, unrestricted, highly dispatchable and emitting resources for a long time, which doesn't mean we don't have RA needs and reliability needs and need to construct a bunch of resources, but we are far away from a future. In fact, I don't think CETA ever calls for a future that eliminates the presence of those resources.
I guess the only clarification I would add on, and then I want to turn this back to the moderator, is not just utilities don't need just resources that will fill in for little periods of time. We need a block resource. The only way we can purchase as a load following customers, we need a block resource, not something that is going to be variable through the day. And so it's not just an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour energy storage that's going to shape this. It needs to truly be a block. Thanks for the comments on that.
Thanks, Clint. Appreciate that. I'm going to hop over to Dana, and then Nicholas, I'll come over to you.
Yeah, I have a question or two. In regards to a developer, how far in advance would your company know on where you're going to build your infrastructure? And then the combination wants avoidance to cultural resources, sacred sites, and native foods. What would your company do to protect these sites?
Yeah, I think that I'm not a permitting guy or gal. I am pretty happy that we've identify and work on that stuff as soon as we can. It's one of the early screens, Dana, that we have against projects. And when we go out and take a look at a project, is we try to go out there and find those sites to avoid them. What the mitigations are, we then go out and engage with the local community and try to sort those out. Sometimes more often than not, we're able to get to a good spot. Sometimes you can't get there, and you just have to figure out what's the right way from there forward. But we identify that as soon as we possibly can. And I mean, we're sinking a lot of money into this stuff, so we want to find them earlier rather than later. And identify them and figure out the problem, figure out how to mitigate, or how we can work with the communities to address their concerns.
So would that be a year, 2 years?
Man, I got to admit, I mean, I can come up with both ends of the spectrum, depending on where we are. Some parts of the country, it's easier than other parts of the country. Here in the Northwest, we try to identify them pretty early. The permitting processes are there. The county or state level permitting processes are very, very thorough in Oregon and Washington. So we work our way through those on the schedule that they allow us. I mean, it's the permitting process is always at least a year long. Prior to that, I don't usually get terribly involved in them that early on.
Okay, so over here on this side of the mountain range, the Yakama Nation has a large area of land base. So no matter which way you go, you're going to impact some type of Yakima Nation site.
Yeah, if there's something specific, a specific project or a specific area, I can't talk to that just because I'm not knowledgeable and I'm not super connected into that area. But if more than willing to set you up and have you chat with some folks here if you'd like to. But when it comes to long-term, I mean, are you thinking more transmission lines, long transmission lines, or the project side?
Any type of energy project, solar project,
right?
Transmission line, wind farms.
And Dana, is part of the interest there wanting to know as early as possible, as soon as possible? Is that what you're?
Yes.
Is that what you're?
As soon as possible.
Okay.
That's your best bet. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Dana. Appreciate that. Nicholas and then Stephen.
I'm trying to start my video.
There you go.
I'm sorry about that. So I might be plowing ground that's already been thoroughly disturbed, but one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of reliability that is utilities look at it in two distinct ways and more than that, but at least two distinct ways. And the solutions are different depending upon the reliability issue that you're dealing with. You know, if you think about what happened in Texas or California, in both instances, they had a situation where they could not deliver electricity because the generating capacity was not available. In Texas, it was because they hadn't done some reinforcement mechanisms to their generators. And in my understanding in California, they simply have run out of power. And some of that's due to policy decisions, some of that's due to economic considerations. In my mind, at least, the obvious solution there is to spend money to either reinforce the steel in the ground that you have, or it is to, put more steel in the ground. But the other kind of issue is more of the reliability issue that Vlad was talking about, where you need a ramping capability. You need to be able to bring resources that are only going to be used a little bit of the time, but are going to be used to help you deal with changes in load that happen quickly. Or you need to fill in a gap because a resource broke and you have to have another one available to take its place. And for that, utilities are doing a good job today of working together. There's something called the Northwest Powerful Resource Sufficiency Project. And it's many utilities have gotten together and they basically back each other up in order to make sure that those sorts of events don't result in a problem where a utility can't meet load. And also it allows you to, by sharing excess resources, it allows you to avoid having too much of them, and it actually saves customers money. So, for that type of concern, there are mechanisms in place and they're being expanded upon and enhanced. And I just want people to know that those sorts of activities are ongoing today. The former, the one I described first, is in some ways the more challenging because you end up with a situation that's pretty rare, but the consequences of losing power in the middle of a cold snap or a heat wave can be pretty severe, including up to people, not being able to use their medical equipment or other things and suffering, pretty significant, including death type of consequences. So, utilities are looking at both of these very carefully. The one I think we're moving farther down this path to a solution than the other. But thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Stephen, your hand is up, and then I think we will take a final comment about Mural or invite people to go to Mural, and then we're going to take a break. So I think you will have the last question or comment here for this panel.
Oh, thank you very much, Susan. And then
Mhm.
after this, I'm going to have to go because I have to get my daughter from school.
Understood.
So I just want to touch on a couple quick things. One, I want to just add to some of the comments that Dana made a few minutes ago. When it comes to cultural resources, and I've been involved in cultural resource protection since 2005 for the Snoqualmie tribe. One thing that I often try to get people to understand, cultural resources, besides being completely unrenewable, our level of concern is based off of, from my perspective, three main things. There's the location of the work is the most important thing, whether we're talking about transmission lines that stretch hundreds of miles, or we're talking about power stations that are on like a quarter of an acre. It doesn't matter where it is. Excuse me. I mean, it matters where it is for the initial concern. Then the scope of work is the next most important thing. So obviously, if you're doing work in a previously disturbed utility line, there's going to be different probabilities based on when that work was originally done. As a practical way of thinking about it, any utility, any construction, anything that was done really before 1990 probably didn't have really good, if at all, cultural resource review done. So even if it's heavily disturbed, most tribes that I work with, and the Snoqualmie for sure, are going to have cultural concerns. Then, of course, the last thing that we look at is really permitting and funding, because that determines what set of laws and policies that you look at. So I just want to just sort of recap: location, scope of work, funding, and permitting are always the three main things that we look at. I don't care what anyone is doing. I also want to add, I and my staff review over 4,000 development projects a year, so about 400 a week. So we're very, very familiar with reviewing projects of all types, whether it's with a CETA, going through the state environmental policy checklist, or whether it's a large proposal for a construction of a ferry terminal or anything. We look at lots of different things. And with the recent modification to the Executive Order 0505 being replaced by 2102, that does put a lot of burden on everyone who reviews projects and permits, especially tribes. But in general, anyone that works in cultural resources is understaffed, underfunded. So we want to make sure that we respond to everything that we have concerns with, but also we want to build relationships with the people that are doing the projects, because we want to be able to have a project go forward without any perception of tribes are trying to stop something from happening, which is very rarely the case, at least from a cultural resources perspective. There's a lot of limitations to what we can ask. And then the last thing that I wanted to add is more of a general comment on this overall conversation that we're having, and I haven't heard it talked about too much, but so I just want to put it out there. You understand we're talking about essentially the large power and transmission infrastructure for Washington. But I do think that everyone involved in power, whether it's generation, installation, construction, maintenance, there really should be a focus on having homeowners and property managers actually take some responsibility and encourage them to use renewable resources like solar panels, potential local wind turbines when possible, to help sort of mitigate the reliance on the grid, especially in the case of there's being some sort of failure, some sort of power outage. Instead of people being flat out without power, we should encourage them to actually be able to take care of their own power needs if they need be. I know that's somewhat of a controversial topic. I know, especially people always say that you can't use solar in Western Washington. It's too clouds. That's not true. One of my coworkers, that's his specialty. He actually has a master's degree in sustainable community development, and he has done lots of work in many areas with clouds. So it takes some fundamental changes in how we look at things, but ultimately our reliance on things should not be on the big power companies. They are part of the solution, but they're not the only solution. And quite frankly, we need their help to make sure that we have in as many ways to have access to power as possible, even if it's not through those companies. Again, I know that's not popular. It's not a popular opinion. I work with power companies all the time. I mentioned that to them. So that being said, thank you all very much for your time.